seeing someone from our side, let's say. After it will be you to present from tomorrow and after tomorrow. So Conférence Kampelmann is here in Barcelona. He's from Brussels, but he's here in Barcelona with Sven for doing an expert survey of organic waste recycling plant. Let's say how it's really working. But he's also very much into the theme of urban metabolism and circulation. You see that we use more now the term territorial metabolism to extend to let's say, suggest that we use a larger territory. He's an economist at first, maybe nice to, you will see, although now he has turned very much to ecology, and he prefers, I think, to work with architects. He's now in the Faculty of Architecture and Research Center, and so that's a great opportunity to have maybe a more theoretical input on the question of urban metabolism, circularity, and so on. Please. Stefan.
Thanks a lot. So my name is Stefan, as Geoffrey said. We have to rush off to the airport in around an hour and 15 minutes with Sven. And I think Sven, during the presentation, will figure out how we get to the airport.
Yeah.
So if you have questions, like ask them during the presentations, because I don't know how much time we have afterwards. Actually, I don't know how much time my presentation will take, because we just put a lot of things together this morning. So whenever something is not completely clear for you, just don't hesitate to interrupt me. So this is a theoretical work that I'm doing to bring two themes together. So one is this notion of metabolism applied to urban contexts. So you could call it urban metabolism or territorial metabolism. And I will come back to these different notions in a minute. And the other thing is the idea of circular flows, so circular economy or circularization. So I was asking, what is circular economy in certain contexts? What is metabolism in certain contexts? And how can these two things brought together? What would it mean to have a circular metabolism? Okay, how would a circular metabolism look like in specific contexts? Okay, so to go a bit more in detail, what motivates this question of putting these things together. And the first thing is that you have in the theory of urbanism or circular economy, you have a kind of a re-emergence of the asymmetry between urban and rural contexts. So if you go I don't know, a decade or two back, the lifestyles of urban populations and rural populations in most countries have converged a lot. So especially in a country like Belgium, for example, if you go to the countryside and you look how family lives in a small town or how family lives in a big city, they would have very similar consumption patterns. They would work in similar jobs. They would have there's a lot of similarities in terms of lifestyle compared to the situation, let's say, before the Second World War, where the rural population was working in agriculture and the city population was working already in services and industry. But now, with this question of the material support of the city, you see that there is actually still a lot of differences that are quite fundamental between the rural and the urban context. Because in an urban context, I mean, the food has to come from somewhere else, the drinking water has to come from somewhere else, whereas in a rural community, normally they have their own water catchments and they have their and they have agriculture around them. So there is really still quite a stark difference between the metabolism of our rural and urban context. And this brings the question, what should urban metabolism, that is so dependent on other regions, look like to be more sustainable or more circular? So this is one of the reasons why I'm interested in circular metabolism for urban cities. Because obviously you have a lot of pressure on these urban agglomerations now, to reform the urbanism, because we understood that they're very dependent, and they're also they consume a lot of energy, they consume a lot of materials, they produce a lot of waste, and from the United Nations over the European institutions to the national institutions, everybody tries to put pressure on big agglomerations to try to solve the linearity of their metabolisms. So there's a lot of objectives being formulated, for example, at the European Union level with the circular economy package that tries to raise the percentage of waste that urban agglomerations have to recycle. And this question now arrives at the city administrations, and they have to solve this question, like how do we do it? How do we decrease waste? How do we increase the circularity of flows? And they turn to people like us to provide solutions or approaches to this question. Do you have a question? No? And very often, like this discussion is framed in terms of, let's have a metabolism that is more circular. You can look at a lot of documents produced by city administrations in Amsterdam and in Paris, in London, in Rotterdam, in Brussels, in Montreal. Like a lot of cities are writing these strategic documents now, talking about circular economy, talking about metabolism, talking about circularization of metabolism. But what does that actually mean? Like, you know, how does that actually theoretically fit together? And other than just drawing a circle, you know, I mean, often they just draw a circle and say, okay, we're going to do something circular with the city. But if you go to the detail, it's much more complicated than just drawing a circle. And the circle in reality might be not only much more complex, but not even feasible. So here I'm trying to get a bit more into the notions and then look also from the experiences that we have in cities like Brussels or other cities to say to what extent this is actually viable. So I framed so this is kind of work in progress that I published in French, but I'm trying to do a more condensed and more accessible version of it in English. So this is also why I need your feedback and comments whether this is clear. I'm trying to answer two questions. So about the territorial metabolism. The kind of studies that you have today, the kind of overviews that have been done on metabolism, often take the form of big compilations of data or flows. For example, in Brussels, we have a publication that's called Metabolism of Brussels, which is like, I don't know, 180 pages of flow charts and tables with statistics and subtext to these tables and flow charts. But it's a lot of information. And if you want to reform the metabolism, it's quite different to identify what are actually the levers of change, and how to condense this information of a big stack of statistics and flowcharts into something that is kind of sufficiently synthetic to be able to take political decisions on a reform. Okay, the politicians or the strategists, or even us as researchers, if you get a big pile of data, like you have to kind of find a way to condense it into something that is more fit for a discussion, actually. And you know, flowcharts are getting more and more complicated. It's difficult to take a decision. So we asked in this paper the question: what are the lines of force? If you imagine like a metabolism, like these metabolistic studies that have been done as a painting, and the lines of force would be like, you know, as in paintings they have lines of force, which are the kind of the main lines of the structure of the painting. What are kind of what is the inherent compositional structure of the metabolism in a more synthetic way? So that's the first question. So it's kind of a theoretical question about territorial metabolism. And the next question is then, okay, if you have a clearer, more concise picture of metabolism, what does it mean? What does it imply if you want to apply the principles of circularity to this metabolism? Okay, so in the first step I try to put up a picture, and the next step I try to modify this picture to become more circular. Okay, so these are kind of the general questions that I'm trying to answer. And this is kind of, this is the, like in a painting, a classical painting, you would have lines of force that kind of determine the composition. So I'm asking, what are the lines of force of a metabolistic study, of like flow charts and like all the information that you have about metabolism? And then these lines of force, I want to turn them into circles. Okay, so it's a bit of an exercise in geometry as well. So about the terminology. So first, as Geoffrey already said in the introduction, like you can like a lot of the literature has used the term urban metabolism. Whereas for different reasons it might make sense to talk about territorial urban metabolism, because if you say urban metabolism, you're really focusing on the urban core, and it's kind of as if everything happens in that urban core. But in a city, like a city by definition, depends on other territories. Like a city is never I mean, that's the definition of the city, to not be self-sufficient. They need food from outside, there's a lot of things that cities need from outside, otherwise it wouldn't be a city. And so it's maybe better to say we're looking at something that is a system that actually functions also beyond the city borders. And this term territorial metabolism captures kind of, it's not only about the city, it's also about the hinterland that interacts metabolistically with the city. So a very important notion about this idea of metabolism is not to forget that it's a metaphor. I mean, a city is not actually a living organism. Like the term metabolism stems from research in biology about living organisms and how these living organisms transform one substance into another. So the metabolism is kind of a change from one thing to something else, etymologically. And urbanists and other disciplines have started to use this term metabolism as a metaphor to describe the functioning of the city. But obviously a city is not a living organism. And there are very fundamental differences. And this analogy between the metabolism of a living system and the metabolism of urbanism is really something also that can create problems in our conceptual understanding. So metabolism, if you take out both lungs of a living organism, it's game over. If you take out some infrastructures of a city, it might not function the same, but it will still survive in some context. Or another example is that the living organism, like the human body, is pretty constant for human experience. I mean, you don't really mess with metabolism over time. It's something that evolves through evolution very slowly. So the metabolism is quite stable. Whereas the metabolism of a city is actually something that can be changed within our lifetimes. So cities have worked 30 years, metabolistically speaking, completely differently than they work today. So the metabolism of a city is something different from the metabolism of a living organism, and really is only a metaphor, an analogy between two things that are fundamentally different. So this is something like, often these analogies kind of, they create images in our heads that we then forget that it's only an approximation, or only a metaphor actually. But as I work on metabolism, like the more I think about cities, and the more the more we try to advance, I'm always coming back to the human body also, so it's quite like for me also, it's like once you have a metaphor and it sticks, like you also think in terms of the body, and you might lose weight, and this is like this in the city, so it really does something to your imagination. But we have to think in some terminology, and I mean, for now, metabolism seems to work quite well. The other important term, obviously, is the distinction between circular and linear flows. And this might like sound very, very clear and straightforward, but actually, like if you think about it, it's a bit more tricky. It's what is quite simple is a linear flow. In the context of an urban metabolism, it means the definition. I'm sure you heard about circular economy and how it's presented. The linear flow starts with the extraction of a resource. Let's say somebody in like some mine in Morocco digs a hole to get phosphorus out of the soil, to transform the rock into some phosphorus pulver that is then transported to European agriculture. So there's the extraction, transformation, then consumption. Let's say the farmer uses the phosphorus as fertilizer on his farm in the consumption phase. But then after the consumption, the product is turned into a waste. Let's say the phosphorus is lost through the leakage, and it gets to the river where it becomes a pollution, and it creates eutrophication in the river. So you have extraction on the one hand, and it ends up with a waste on the other hand. It's a perfectly linear thing, because at the end the waste doesn't become again a resource. That's why it's linear. There's no loop back from the waste to the initial extraction. So that's quite clear, I think, like in terms of conceptual chain. But the circular flow is a bit more tricky because it not only entails that there is no waste. Sometimes when people talk about circular economy, the only thing that they focus is about the waste thing. Like reducing waste means circular economy. And now it has become very difficult if you talk about for example, strategies in cities with policymakers. They associate anything that is waste reduction to circular economy. So somebody has a recycling idea, they go to the regional administration, say I have a recycling idea and it fits in your circular economy program. But recycling is actually not necessarily a circular economy, because the reduction of waste in itself is not a sufficient condition for circularity. Okay, you can have a reduction of waste, you can have an elimination completely of waste, and still not be able to have a loop back to the initial resource. Okay, so for the example of phosphorus that I just mentioned, you might have a recycling of the phosphorus. Like the phosphorus is let's say, absorbed by the plants that the farmer grows. So part of the phosphorus will be in the carrot that the farmer grows. The carrot then goes to the city. Somebody in the city says, okay, great, I will recycle the phosphorus in the city. And I'm financed by the circular economy program of my city. How does it recycle? They recover the phosphorus that it has been metabolized by the humans, so with some kind of dry toilet or some kind of stuff like that. And the rest of the carrot, like the skin of the carrot, is recycled in a compost station. And let's say they recover the entire phosphorus of that is contained in the carrot. The waste is reduced. Okay, in that case, there is no phosphorus waste going out, but there is no return to the mine in Morocco. Okay, so we're not reproducing like a loop that can potentially go on. Okay, so the farmer will continue to buy phosphorus from Morocco because he doesn't get the phosphorus back, because the phosphorus is all within the city, it stays within the city in the community compost garden of the people who were subsidized by the circular economy program. But there's no return to the phosphorus origin, and there's no loop actually. There's nothing that can go potentially on forever. And the notion of circularity becomes like that's a metaphor to ecosystems, like natural ecosystems, like a forest. And natural ecosystems, you not only don't have waste, but you also have perfectly closed loops. So it's really important to keep in mind. It's not only about reducing waste; it's also about closing the loops. It might sound kind of obvious, but actually this we need to close the loops kind of slips away when you go to actual projects that have been implemented in circular economy. Few of them actually try to do like really closing a loop that then can recycle forever. I mean, no loop in reality will actually recycle forever, because there's always come waste. There's always imperfect loops because of the second law of thermodynamics. But it's very I mean, the circular economy principle should at least try to reduce waste and close the loop to the resource that we're talking about. Okay, so this is in terms of conception, and just a few examples of this. Like this is like the cover of Zola, Le Ventre de Paris. And there's a lot of references in circular economy, for example, to the kind of agriculture that has happened in the late 19th century, especially around Paris, because the urban agriculture and the peri-urban agriculture in Paris in the second half of the 19th century was very, very high performing. They were very, very fertile, and a lot of the stuff that has been produced, that has been consumed in Paris by that time, that Zola describes in his novel, has come from peri-urban areas of Paris. And people refer to this in a circular economy context because the fertility of the peri-urban agriculture at that area came from the reuse of organic matter from Paris at that time. And Zola describes this very well in another novel, which is called L'Œuvre, when Claude Lantier, the protagonist, goes to visit the farm, and actually he goes with one of the women who sell vegetables in Paris, and this woman, she collects the manure and the horse shit because Paris at that time had a lot of horses, so she collects the organic matter from the market, like all the leaves and everything she finds from the horses and all that stuff. When she drives back with her empty cart back to her vegetable garden in Nanterre, and so she brings the fruit. And she goes back with the organic material, and she has a compost. And then, like Claude Lantier, he says, "Oh, this salad, I've seen it 10 times already." So it's really like, and you can see how people today see, "Oh, this is circular economy. This is what we want to do." But it's not circular. It's reducing waste because there was no waste at that time. And there's a famous French urbanist called Sabine Barle, and she wrote a book about the invention of waste. Okay, and she said like a bit after this period, actually urbanism invented, and there was factors that urban agglomerations produced waste, but before that there was no waste. In this situation, you don't have waste doesn't mean that it's circular, because the organic matter that they collected from the market and from the streets didn't come from the kind of vegetable gardens that produced the vegetables. Okay, the food for the horses that you find back in the horse shit came from what's it called, the area in La Terre?
La Beauce.
La Beauce.
La Beauce. La Beauce.
So there's other more distant regions in France that produce the corn or the avoine. I don't know what's
Avoine, toutes les céréales, le blé.
Avena, yeah, they produce the cereals, and these cereals were then consumed by the city. Okay, but they never got, like, the nutrients in that material never got back to the initial fields. So the fields got poorer and poorer, and at some point they got so poor that they had to substitute their fertilizers with chemical fertilizers that they got from China and from Africa, because there was no return. But at that time you already had also production from Russia. I mean, and even in the Middle Ages, a city like Brussels already imported cereals from the Baltics. So the reason why this kind of circular context worked so well is because they absorbed constantly nutrients from outside, and then they circulated these nutrients within their urban agglomeration. But it's not circular in the sense that it can't go on forever, because you're just absorbing, impoverishing actually the agricultural areas that are further away. And this is why, I think it's dangerous to look at urban metabolism and try to do something circular in that urban metabolism, because you actually just depleting the resources of areas that you don't see. So, for example, the Beauce. So this is and today, this is the second half of the 19th century. And yesterday we met an initiative about a recycling project here in Barcelona, which is called the La Revolta project, and I tried to with this guy try to make a small diagram of how a system works. He has a peri-urban, he has 5 hectares in a place called Linas de Valles. He produces biological food over there. It's a very nice initiative. They also have urban gardens, and it's all very nice. They bring this food with a truck to schools and a restaurant, where they have a pilot project, and then they separate the organic waste from the school. They have some kind of pre-treatment for hygienic reasons. They put the pre-treated organic waste in a truck. The truck goes back to the farm, where they have a compost, and the compost goes back to the farm. Perfectly circular economy program of Barcelona finances the thing. Everybody's happy. And then you look at this. This is the basic circle, But then you look more in detail and say, okay, the school, where do they get their food from? Obviously they get food from this guy, but he only has 5 hectares, and there's a lot of schools and there's a lot of restaurants. So most of their food actually comes from conventional agriculture. Okay, and the conventional agriculture, I put it like as a small circle outside of the circular system. So most of the nutrients that he captures with his compost actually come from somewhere else. I would say like 95% at least, because his sale to the school is very minimal. So you have a constant input from outside. It's the same as in Paris from the second half of the 19th century. This will not solve the phosphorus depletion at a larger scale. Okay, this is nice. I mean, it's nice. It's a good project. I'm not saying we shouldn't try to do things like that, because we are reducing waste, and we're doing something very sensible with the waste. But this is not solving the more structural problem in agriculture that will become more and more important, and we need we need the conventional agriculture to switch to another level, to substitute chemical fertilizers with the kind of phosphorus that we have in our waste streams. Okay, and there's another input, because for this compost you also need, like in a compost, you need not only the organic fraction that you get from kitchen, you also need a vegetable fraction, which is more like woody stuff. And you need to combine like the kitchen waste with more woody elements in a 50-50 combination. And here in his farm he doesn't have that. So he buys from somewhere else half of the quantity that he puts into his compost. So there's also a permanent depletion of some other ecosystem that's here that goes to his compost as well. You know? So we are discussing with him actually more about like how he can produce this fraction in his own ecosystem, so he's not depleting somebody else's ecosystem for the organic fraction. Okay. So I will. So it's like we were in a conference in Montreal about the circular economy, and in almost every letterbox in Montreal you have a pas circulaire, donc c'est pas forcément circulaire. So it's not necessarily circular. This setup. So now I come to this very briefly to this idea. What are the three lines of force? Like how could we find like a very concise and synthetic way of presenting what territorial metabolism of a city is about? Okay, so if you want to break up to really simple elements and discuss about it, what would be these lines of force? And we think you can summarize a lot of stuff about the metabolism of a city with three dimensions, with three different elements. And these three would be the spatial structure of the metabolism, the intensity of the metabolism, so this is kind of the intensity of the flows within this spatial structure. And the third is the technical agencies that underpin the functioning of the metabolism. Okay, so I will now go quickly into each of these three and discuss not only what it is, but also how it can be measured, like what kind of tools we have to depict each of these three dimensions, and then ask the question, okay, if we accept that this is an important dimension of metabolism, and if we measure it this way with our indicators, with our maps, with our tools that we have, what does it imply if you want to circularize this dimension of a metabolism? Okay, so for each of these three, I'll try to do this very quickly with you now. So the first is the spatial structure. So in the spatial structure, you could present it like this is a classic presentation. If you look about if you go into the literature and you ask how people represent spatially a metabolism, it comes from a team around Sabine Barre, the French urbanist geographer. I think she's a geographer. Gilles Bilen is somebody from Brussels actually, who worked with a famous ecologist called Paul Duvigneau in Brussels. He did his PhD with Paul Duvigneau, but he works now in Paris with Sabine Barre and does this kind of research. It shows if you have the system of Paris, where the input in terms of firewoods, animal products and vegetable products are sourced from, and it shows this spatially. Okay, so some stuff will come immediately from the vicinity of the Paris agglomeration and Ile-de-France, and then if you go further away, but there are some other regions that provide a lot of input, and it gives you kind of an idea where this stuff comes from in a spatial distribution, just in terms of a map. And then they did similar things by extending this hinterland notion not only to Paris regions but to other European countries, and then also to other regions in the world. Okay, so they describe, for example, for this food supply of Paris, they have a study in which they show the spatial structure with French regions. Then there's some stuff coming from the Netherlands, from Belgium, and Spain and Italy, and then they add Latin America to the system, because a lot of indirect inputs to European agriculture come from Latin America, like the soy and the corn that is then fed to the animals in Europe. Like the Belgian cows or the Belgian pigs then eat like input from Latin America, so they extend the system with indirect inputs a bit, but they provide a spatial structure. Look, spatially, this is how it works. But this representation shows the spatial structure, but it only shows the input side. Okay, so it only shows where stuff comes from. So the provisioning, what we call the provisioning spaces. But if you look at the metabolism, well, there's not only the provisioning spaces, there's also spaces that have to absorb the waste. So you have to add to this kind of image not only where stuff comes from, but also where the stuff will go once it passed through the metabolism of the city. And for this, there's some other tools that you can use, or that have been used in the literature, and some use, for example, what we call the ecological footprint of a city. And here you have, like, this is a study that has been done on cities in the Baltics, and they show, like, for each, so the metric is that for each square kilometer of cities in the Baltics, like in a sample of 29 large cities in the Baltic countries, for each square kilometer you have so much spaces that you need to keep the city alive, to keep the people in this square kilometer happy and alive. And it's quite a lot, actually. I mean, you need a lot of forest, you need a lot of arable land for food, and you need a lot of marine area to produce the oxygen and then metabolize the drinking water. But actually, if you look also at the spaces that you need to absorb the waste that is produced by the city, they're even bigger. They're actually much bigger than the provisioning spaces. So the spatial structure, the complete spatial structure of the city, is actually something that is enormously bigger than the city itself, both on the provisioning and on the absorbing side. Okay, so this is because you need arable land for the metabolism of for the organic waste that you get out. For example, you need a forest to reproduce the oxygen. You need wetlands and inland water also to water systems to generate new drinking water, etc. So this is like also an interesting way to represent the spatial structure. And one thing that is borne out by this kind of analysis, and that's quite essential about this idea of circular economy, is that these two areas, not only they are very big, but they don't coincide. Okay, so they are linear in the way that this arable land here is not the same that the arable land there. Okay, so there's no loop. The nutrients do not go back to the same places where they came from initially. Normally, these two spaces are completely disconnected. And for Brussels, the drinking water comes from Wallonia. 98% of the drinking water that we consume in Brussels come from Wallonia. But then the wastewater goes with once it's cleaned, it goes through the River Seine into a completely other water system and goes to the North Sea. So the area that absorbs the wastewater of Brussels is not the same as the area of provisioning of the water, for the example of water. Okay, so if you want to do something circular, there's several things that you, like in terms of spatial structure, there's several things that you could try to do. And I try to visualize these things very, 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 conceptualize them very quickly. Now, what we this is a situation that we're kind of now. You get inflows from outside, from areas that are more or less distant to the urban ecosystem, and then you get waste flows that get out. So these are the waste flows that get out of the city, and this is the stuff that gets into the city, and like these arrows don't come from the same direction. Okay, so this is where the food comes from, this is where the waste goes from, and they don't coincide. Okay, and what the circular economy programs in a lot of cities try to do is to try to do something circular then within the city and not look at these regions out of the city. And I think what we should try to do is to go to see what are the areas that we're exchanging with, metabolizing with, and these areas will be in some kind of system, but a system that is larger on any count than the city itself. No, so for each city, this system will be larger, but the extent of which the extent of the system will depend on the morphology and on the context of the city, but on any account will be larger than the city. And you try to create circular movements that exchange the different materials in this territorial metabolism that you define. Okay? And what this implies is A, the metabolism is larger than the city. B, you try to coincide the absorption spaces with the provisioning spaces. Okay, so you have kind of, in theory, you should have a perfect overlap between the provisioning spaces and the absorbing spaces, because otherwise you can't do something circular. Okay, and the third thing that it implies is that the people of the administration of the city have to talk to the people of the administration of these other areas, and that is rarely happening. You know, so people, like each region gets instructions from the national level. You have to do something circular, and then they try to do something circular, and they end up with this. And they try hard, and they're nice people, and you know I support them with their initiatives. But what they can't do is actually do something in the way of circular loops that can continue in a metabolistic system. Okay, so we have to find ways to define what is the area that we're talking about. What would be like an efficient socio-political, ecological space in which these things could happen. And once we define the space, you know, you bring the actors together that they can negotiate configurations that actually allow these kind of circular loops in reality. You know, and here I draw, for example, a circle that is larger than the scale. Let's say we want to continue to eat bananas, and the bananas don't grow in Brussels, and they don't grow anywhere near. They will have to come from somewhere else. Then you have a decision. Well, do we accept that? And this circular loop is very, very difficult to organize because bananas grow far away, and it's completely economically insane to try to bring the nutrients back to Latin America, for example. What do we do? You know, do we stop eating bananas, or do we try to produce bananas in greenhouses closer to this, or do we accept that certain loops continue to be linear? You know, but this kind of setup can maybe help us to say, like, okay, there are potential loops, but they are not economically viable, or they're outside of the political entity that we created to negotiate circularity, you know, or we just decide not to eat bananas from somewhere. And just a very simple exercise. What we try to do is like we define an area around the city of Brussels, which corresponds kind of to the Brabant Wallon and Brabant Flamand, which are like areas with a lot of agriculture. And now these areas, like the shape of this is determined by the areas that other cities around would need also for the provisioning spaces. So it's kind of the idea that like each city needs these provisioning spaces around them. And this is kind of based on where Liège, Anvers, Charleroi, where other cities around Brussels lie that need their own spaces. And then we try to draw up what would be the space available for if you have these different systems together. And then create kind of an entity that could manage these. But now, like the farmers in this area, they produce for the world market and not for Brussels. And you have only very, very small, few initiatives around, like really in the vicinity of Brussels that produce for Brussels. So there is scope of negotiating maybe something more circular and more local in this area. I'm ask questions because otherwise I talk and then I'll run off and I have no clue whether you disagree or whether you got anything of. Is it okay so far? Yeah? Okay. So the second dimension of the territorial urbanism, like the second line of force, is the intensity. Okay? By this we mean the throughput through the city. Like, you know, how much stuff goes through the city? What are the flows that go through the city? And this kind of the metrics or the indicators that have been used to identify to characterize the intensity of the metabolism are things like material flow analysis, where you try to get all the mass balances, how much goes in, like what are the quantities of like certain types of substances that go in, how do they modify the stocks in the city, and then what goes out, and you really trace very scientifically the mass balance of everything, where nothing is lost. Like, you trace all the conversions from solid into gas and from liquid into like a solid. Like, you really trace the whole material balances, and you call this a material flow analysis. It's also linked to something like a life cycle analysis, that you go through time, how things evolve, and this has been done by scientists. This is really scientific stuff with a lot of statistics and transformations, like biochemical reactions as well. And they produce tools also in forms of flowcharts and tables to characterize these inputs. An important distinction from this is there can be metabolism that is more intensive or more extensive. You have more flows across the same entity, that would be a more intense metabolism, and if you have less flows for the same size, you have a more extensive metabolism. So, and this is kind of like a very simplistic representation of this. So you get the stuff in, you get stuff out, and you see there's differences in size. So there must be like some kind of stock that is accumulated in here. So the inflows are smaller than the outflows, and that leads to a change in stock, for example, for a certain flow. This is a very, very simplistic representation of a material flow analysis. So what would it imply to have something circular in terms of flows? Okay, and this is a question actually that is kind of at the origin a bit of the idea of circular economy, because one of the first things that people were saying when they talked about circular economy is that we have to reduce waste. Okay, and the reduction of waste means you have to reduce certain flows. Okay, so the flows that are clearly toxic, for example, let's say nuclear waste or substances that cause cancer, or like something that is clearly like a polluting substance and the waste, well, we should reduce the intensity of that flow. Okay, and kind of everybody agrees with that principle. So this is what I mark here. Like if we have really like polluting stuff, well, the waste that is toxic, the toxic substances, that should be something that we reduce. But the people that promote circular economy today, especially the private side. So let's say there's a foundation in the UK called the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and they do a lot of promotion for circular economy. And they work with companies like Google or Cisco or Renault or really big multinational companies. They're interested in this bit. They say, well, it's very sensible not to produce toxic waste. So we are not producing toxic waste. So we are doing we are in the circular economy movement. But the other flows we try to circularize. So this is also very nice. Like Renault wants to sell cars, so we will sell more cars that we then somehow the materials will be circulating in a circular loop. So what they're not really talking about is the intensity of the other flows. Let's say the flows that are not directly toxic. Okay? And in principle, they're actually trying to promote that these flows could increase. Because any document that you see from this version of circular economy, let's say from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, they will tell you, come to the circular economy team, we will help you to grow. We will help your company to grow, meaning to sell more. Okay? So what they're actually doing, they circularize certain flows, they eliminate toxic materials, but the rest should increase and not decrease. So in terms of intensity, this could lead even to a situation in which you increase the intensity of the metabolism. Okay? And the problem with that is you always have waste. There is no perfect loop. It's impossible for humans to create perfect loops because we have always technical transformations with energy that we have to put into the processes, and there will always be waste. And recycling chains, like even the most efficient recycling chains that we have in the world, are quite imperfect. And I think the best example of this is iron as metal. Metal is very easy to recycle, and it's almost always recycled. I think there have been some studies that at the global scale, almost 80% of metal is recycled. So it's almost perfect. We're really trying to do a very good job at metal. The process of recycling metal is quite easy. and you know, it's something that is done on a very large scale. If we did what we do to metal in every substance, would be very, very advanced in terms of closing loops and being circular. But it's only 80%. And the rest of the 20% of new metal have to come from somewhere. And that means we continue to deplete the stock of mineral ore that we need to produce metal. You know? And this is especially problematic in a context of growth, because the consumption of metal continues to grow every year because of the emerging countries. So China uses more metal every year. So this 20% of metal that has to be produced new, because we only recycle 80%, increases every year. You know, so we will deplete metal anyways. You know, and the study, like there's a very nice study by a French environmentalist called François. He says if we, in the context, like if China and the other emerging countries continue to grow like they do, and their consumption of metal continues to grow like they do, and when we can't radically increase the recycling of metal than we do today, the only thing that recycling will bring us is that the depletion of mineral ore will be 15 years later than if we don't recycle at all, because of economic growth. Okay, so what I want you to take from this example is that recycling is absolutely not sufficient if we continue to have economic growth. You can recycle, you can do a very, very hard job at recycling if you have economic growth. The only thing that we will achieve with this is to delay a bit the moment where we get really into trouble by 10, 50, 20 years. Okay? So it's like a strategy like this is green growth that doesn't work. It's just a reassuring multinationals of continue to grow. Okay, it's not solving the underlying issue of resource depletion. So what does that mean? Yes?
But you're telling if there is an economic growth, we will never be able to stop the consumption of the inputs. But should we stop growing? I mean, this could be the answer.
If you want to avoid resource depletion, yes. A clear yes.
Yeah.
Like in terms of materials.
Yeah.
Like I'm not like it's a tricky thing, because I always when I present to people who from Veolia or they always say, okay, well, I have a question, like we need to grow, huh? I mean, of course I mean you get but like that's what I'm trying to present here. If you like the conclusions that are being drawn in the literature in terms of intensity, if you want to have a sustainable system with the loops that are the most close possible, you have to move from a scenario like this to a scenario like this, where you reduce the intensity of flows. Okay? Because if you reduce the intensity of flows, you also reduce the intensity of the waste, and that's the most sensible thing to do. So you have to, like, instead of finding to focusing on strategies to recycle stuff and then produce more and more, which is what we're doing now with circular economy, you have to find other ways of organizing circular economy that close the loops, but that at the same time reduce the flows and not increase the flows. And I don't know. I mean, this is a very interesting discussion that is happening in a lot of places, and I wish we had the time to engage in this discussion here. But I'm very skeptical with the possibility of combining economic growth, which almost always implies the intensification of material flows, contrary to what we think. Like we think we are all with iPads and we're all virtual, but actually we are not. Like the material intensity is not stopping to grow nowhere. Like nowhere, always. And there's a very strong correlation between economic growth and resource flows. When we had the crisis in 2008, 2009, that was the only moment, like in the last 20 years, where material flows decreased. Like here in Barcelona, we were looking at the statistic yesterday. The waste flow in 2008, 2009 decreased substantially because people had less money to go to the shopping center and produce waste. Like, you know, there's a very clear correlation between economic growth and inputs and outputs. And people think about, like, you know, there's very nice reports at the United Nations and everywhere, everybody talks about we're going to decouple, like we're going to have growth, but at the same time reduce material intensity. It's not happening. It has not happened anywhere. I mean, the Chinese, they're really trying very hard to implement this because they're seeing the consequence of growth. But the Chinese government is the first government in the world that creates laws to reduce economic growth, because they see that they have to reduce the intensity of their economic activity because of the ecological consequences of growth. You know? And like now, if you look at the presidential campaign in France, or if you look at the elections in Germany, nobody in Europe would win an election by saying like, yeah, we have a platform of saying like we're going to reduce economic growth. I mean, nobody in Europe is doing this in the mainstream. Like, you know, people like Geoffrey or like Nadia maybe. Like, we are trying to promote degrowth scenarios in one way or another. But if you go into the political or economic mainstream, we are still very much focused into growth. Whereas the Chinese government is the first government that officially has a policy of saying we're going to reduce growth because of ecological reasons, because we see that the growth is correlated with the increase with the intensity of the flows, and we just can't manage, we can't cope with it because we're going to kill ourselves with lung cancer, or like, you know, because in the cities it's completely inviable to increase the material throughput without decreasing the quality of life, for example. You know, so like what I wanted to say is, if you are serious about the circularity in terms of the intensity, the only way forward is not only to reduce the toxic substances, which is always a sensible thing to do, to reduce the toxicity of the flows, but you also have to reduce the intensity of all the other flows as well. And that means that's a really strong political thing to do. You know, and I haven't seen like we were discussing this with Nadia a bit. Like, she was saying, like, in certain circles in Flanders, maybe there is already kind of an awareness in the policy cycles that you also need to degrow the economy. But I think this is still very far from, for example, from the regional program that we have in Brussels, the circular economy program in Brussels, still saying we're going to be circular and we're going to grow. You know, so this is something that we have to work on. Just very quickly on the last dimension, because it is very important as well. The technical agencies. So you have a metabolism with a certain spatial structure and with a certain intensity of flows. Okay, but what we haven't talked a lot about is the actors that underpin this metabolism. Okay, so you have the infrastructure, like the technical infrastructure of a city. Like a metabolism cannot function if you don't have the infrastructure, right? But this infrastructure needs a superstructure. Like, by this I mean like the ideas, the concepts, the power relations. Like, somebody has to decide which infrastructure we put in place for a certain metabolism. Okay, so if you put a certain system of pipes, like engineers invent a system of pipes, you put in the pipes that will coordinate the water flows through these pipes. You know? And it turns out that a lot of historical studies that have been done trying to understand how territorial urbanism changes through time. I mean, they always say, like, it is a very, very important thing to look at the kind of people that design the infrastructure. Who has the power about deciding what kind of infrastructure you put in place, and what are the ideas, the worldview, the theories, the power relations in the decision of putting infrastructure A or infrastructure B in place. And this we call kind of the superstructure of infrastructure. You know? So it's kind of the superstructure of infrastructure. And here, like, and if you want to simplify a lot, you basically have two very opposing things that might happen. You can have, on the one hand, like the standard thing that happens most of the time, at least that's what we do since the Industrial Revolution. We have a technocracy in which the power is held by experts, by technocrats, who are professionals, who know what to do. Okay, so engineers, like next door we have the School of Industrial Engineering. If you ask them, we have a problem with organic flows in Brussels, what should we do? They will say, no problem. We're going to build a big biogas plant. And this biogas plant, you give us the organic waste, we're going to digest it, we're going to produce biogas and compost, and just give us 25 million euros. We build this infrastructure, we put a couple of guys who run the infrastructure. That's the standard technocratic solution to this kind of problem. And on the other hand, for the same problem, so what should we do with the organic waste? How could it become more circular? No? How could we avoid wasting the nutrients that are in the organic waste? You have people like this guy, Benoit Zalzac, like a friend of us, who has a community compost in Brussels. Okay, so he's going to the citizens and saying like, yeah, we're going to keep our own waste, we're going to build this compost station ourselves. I know how it works. Like, you know, they have a emancipation. They don't need other experts to do their own thing. They have their own technology. It's a very simple technology if you compare it to the biogas plant, but they can do it themselves. And it's kind of the empowerment, the emancipation, technologically speaking, of the citizens themselves. And this is a slightly more sophisticated model in London, where they have actually a biogas plant, a very small, simple installation, which they built their own to boost their biogas in London, close to King's Cross. So you have two alternative ways to think about the technical agencies that underpin the metabolism. But the thing is that actually, you like in any, like cities are normally so big, and things are so complicated in these cities, and the flows like are so enormous, and a lot of people don't have the time or the will to engage in these kind of activities, that you have to have some kind of technical infrastructure, and you have to have some way to communicate and coordinate what the people are doing. You know, so the technocratic model alone doesn't work, and the technical emancipation alone also doesn't work. And it's like there's hardly any dialogue between these two areas. And it's the dialogue between these areas that can only solve the issue. So this is what we are trying to, like, how could we engage in a process that brings these two visions of technical agencies together. And like just to show you a bit of repercussions of the lack of dialogue of these two areas. No, if in Barcelona you have like since 2010 you have these brown containers in which people are supposed to put their organic waste. Okay, and then some of it is brought to big digestion plants, which convert the organic material to biogas. And afterwards they compost it and sell it to the farmers, for example. And this is the first part of the digester. This is the first part of the plant, a plant that has cost like 32 million euros, and which was built in 2009. So this here is the stuff that comes in. So they get the containers, the brown containers from Barcelona, and they drive it up to the digester. And this is the stuff that, you know, the truck empties this. And it's not organic waste. So there's plastics, there's everything, like, you know, because people don't understand, or they just throw in, or they don't care. I mean, they're not involved in the digester. They're just told, like, this is a container, there's another container, there's another container. And we asked a lot of people, we looked in a lot of containers in Barcelona, it absolutely doesn't work. Because when you get to the plant, there's everything that arrives there, you know. So because of this, the engineers said, okay, we have impurities in our inflow. Let's build a first pre-treatment area with machines that also cost 10 million euros and which are very complicated to maintain and which are very costly. And all the machines that you see here, and they continue for another 50 meters, the sole purpose of this machine is to sort this stuff and get the impurities out. Okay? Because they can't deal with the people of just not putting your Coca-Cola can in the organic waste. You know? So they have a technical solution to a social deficiency, and this technical solution means that here, like, I don't believe in their statistics, but they told us that there's 10% of impurities in here, and the treatment that they have to do to get the 10% out, by this treatment they lose 40% of the organic matter. Okay? So what goes into the digester is actually only half of what goes into the organic bin in Barcelona. Okay, and the whole thing is because on the one hand you have a technical, more and more sophisticated technical setup, and the other hand you have a social problem, and they showed us. I mean, okay, so and I invite you to look what it's in there, and like I ask you to evaluate whether only 10% of it is not organic waste. This is, for example, this is a picture that we took from an organic waste bin.
Obviously,
in Barcelona. And I swear it's representative for what we saw. You know, so there might be organic waste in there, but to get it, you're losing half of the organic waste, and you're spending a lot of money in machinery, and very sophisticated machinery to get it out. And on the other hand, you have guys like these in a community compost garden, like that's the technical emancipation guy. Like we walked up to it, like they built their own compost station. The compost is perfect. There's like, you know, they have like there's no impurities. It's 100% organic material. There's no impurities. And he was saying, yeah, you shouldn't put too many eggshells because the eggshells are not the right composition of my compost. You know, so they're really perfect. You know, because this guy knows exactly what to do. You know, he understands the process, and he's using himself the compost to grow food in a community garden. You know, so yeah.
Is it then maybe a better solution? I mean, that's not obviously not the perfect solution, but would an incineration plant be a better solution than a biomass plant?
Well, I mean, yeah, but economically yes, but then you're losing the nutrients. Okay, and in the current setting, it's out of the question because the European Union forces you to have 50% of recycling of your municipal waste. For if you put everything in the incinerator, at some point the European Commission will come and say we're going to stop regional funds or something. So it's not an option. But this is what Brussels is doing. It's easier, and Brussels is doing this, and it hasn't been such a wrong thing. Because in Barcelona they didn't have enough incinerators and they used landfill, and landfill is even worse. You know? But this guy, I mean, it's perfect what they're doing, but it's not a solution that can be developed at a systematic scale, and it's also something that can't deal with all situations. You know, for example, it's very difficult to treat animal products. So if you have a meat, for example, a restaurant is not allowed to use this kind of system because they have potentially pathogens in their organic flow, and this installation cannot ensure the pasteurization of the organic material. You know, so it's not something that can be applied everywhere. And also in the city, there's not the space for this to happen everywhere. You know. And even though I think this is a very nice thing, if you go back to what I said about the closing the loop to the agriculture, this is a model that constantly continues to deplete the real agriculture, because what this guy eats comes in part from his vegetable garden, but he was also going to the market and the supermarket to buy food from elsewhere. So his agriculture is so, like in the 19th century, his agriculture is so high performing because he's constantly getting nutrients from outside. So this is actually not a circular thing. It's reducing waste and it's doing something very, very sensible, but it can't be a model that allows cities to survive in the long term in a more systematic perspective. You know, so the challenge in the end is to bring the different areas together. And this is the compost that he got. It has really nothing to do with the compost that he get out of the composting plant with plastic bits. I mean, it's really very different. So like when we talked to the people from the agency, from the waste agency here in Barcelona, it was kind of very schematically, like in the 80s and 90s, they were looking at mechanical and chemical treatments of saying like, okay, we are engineers, we are professionals, we are trying to do this, we buy the right machinery, we're going to solve the issue, no problem. Then they realized, like by the early 90s, that the mechanical and the chemical machinery is not appropriate. And there was a lot of like technical issues, and there were investments, like huge investments that were complete blunders, and that were done in the early 90s. So I said, okay, let's do something more biological, you know. So let's have biogas stations, let's have composting stations. So they moved a bit or they added the biological aspect to the mechanical and mechanical. But since what you see on this image, it doesn't work if you don't have a strategy of just communicating the right message to the people and find some kind of system in which the treatment, so you have a social element in it that you have to deal with. So that's kind of the realization, like since 10 years, that I say, okay, if you really want to do something, you have to also have a social strategy somehow, And they see, for example, these community gardens, these community gardens as one of the social strategies. They're actually not so much interested in the tons that they treat, but they're interested in this guy understanding what he's doing and talking to his neighbor, saying, don't put Coca-Cola cans in the organic waste run, because that's going to create a problem at the plant. So it's like a social strategy of saying, we're putting these compost stations everywhere. They don't treat a lot of organic waste, but they will help us dealing with the organic waste in a social way more systematically. So you have to find strategies of combining actually the technical emancipation, because that will increase the quality of your inputs to the technical solutions. So this is what we're doing now. We are trying to find ways in which these things are not sequences and completely uncoordinated. We're trying to find ways in which mechanical and chemical solutions that you need for certain situations, biological treatment that you need in order to bring stuff back to agriculture for the case of organic waste, in composting or digestion plants, with social solutions that are kind of creating a coherence. And we are really working, and there it becomes interesting, I think, because for example, the composting plant can be designed differently from the engineers if they know what is the complementarity on the social side that we want to plug in. For example, if you have composting stations, maybe you should have an industrial compost plant and not an industrial digestion plant, because then you are explaining the same message on both sides. So it really has repercussions on the type of technological decisions that you take at the technocratical level, if you know what is happening on the social level. So we are trying to try to find ways to combine these things rather than keeping them separate in a more monolithic structure. And this is something that, we have to go quick, but I think it takes time, and this is the kind of research that we're doing for Brussels in cooperation with cities like Barcelona, Milan, Paris, etc. So I think this is what I had to say for today, but there's...
Do you think that it will be possible to reach this kind of joint actions, because all the solutions that you propose all seem to have big lacks, and they're not solving really the problem. So do you think that it will be possible to reach such a unity in the management of the waste, or it will be something, an utopia that will never be reached?
I don't know. Really, I really don't know. I'm trying. We're trying to do it. We have the political mandate in Brussels, and we have the means to try to do it. But I don't know at this stage whether we're gonna manage to do it. And now it's we started in February with the political mandate and with money and with organizations, with a platform, with all the actors that have to be around the table. And we have 3 years to produce something, to produce kind of blueprint of how this could look like. But and he's doing a documentary about this process, because it's something that is not being done normally. Normally you ask either only the engineers or only the social science guys to do something, and then then it doesn't work. So we're trying to experiment with a new type of process and a new type of approach, and over 3 years. And in 3 years you will see the documentary whether this is a failure or not. But I don't know at this stage. We are trying. I'm trying really honestly and hard, but I don't know, because it's very difficult. And these things take a lot of time. Like an incinerator, you build it once, for 25 years you're going to be stuck with that incinerator. Every city has a legacy of decisions that have been taken like 10, 20, 30 years ago. And Barcelona, like it's completely visible, like the legacy. But in Brussels also we have this incinerator, so everything you do it in relation to what has been done before. So you just don't start from a clean page. So I don't know. This also makes it very, very difficult to say like, no, okay, we're going to do something else. So maybe that's why I put 2020. Maybe in a couple, like maybe next year we find something, but then in 2020 we are at a process that is going towards the better solution. But I really don't know if we're going to do it. If you have an idea, please help.
Are you comparing your work to maybe other countries that are working longer in this field, like I don't know, in Netherlands or in Germany? We also have these problems.
Yeah.
Are there like more increased works or more sophisticated works in other countries?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why we're here. But Barcelona, they were one of the first, like Catalonia, they started in '93, which is already quite a lot of experience, and we are talking to other cities, and like we are in a network with a lot of different cities, but it really like I have the impression it's not like cities that have started earlier. Let's say like in Germany they started already in the 80s. Then Scandinavia, already late 80s, early 90s. Italy, they have a very good collection system, not so good treatment, but they have a good collection system. Netherlands also. So everybody started, but it's not a linear progress towards. That's not a linear process towards progress. Those who started earlier, like let's say Barcelona, they made huge mistakes. I mean, they made huge mistakes. In the 1990s with the kind of technical equipment that the Germans sold them, because the Germans said, hey, we already have 10 years experience and we have these big plants, don't you want to buy one or two of them, and we're going to pay with European money. So of course they said yes, but these plants actually didn't work. So it's not like you started earlier, you just have to talk to the guy with the most experience. You talk to the guy with the most experience. It's interesting to talk to them because also of the lessons of what can go wrong, and but we're engaging in this dialogue to understand trajectories of cities and ups and downs and technological blunders, and obviously we're not trying to do this ourselves, and we are trying to for the case of organic waste, it looks like Zurich, Vienna, Barcelona. Milan and Uppsala seem to be the top 5 kind of in terms of what they're doing. And then I go to Barcelona and I look in the organic waste bin and now I want to go to circulaire, because it always looks nicer, on circular diagrams than it looks in the actual waste bin.
I'm not sure on the political level, on current level, it's going to change much. I think more, maybe we need to do something on the behavior of people, like maybe using strategies from the commercials, like they pursue us to buy more stuff to make this economy grow. Maybe if we teach more people to live with less, that's perfectly possible. Maybe we can do, this is going to bring the project forward.
No, absolutely. I mean, this is why we're doing a documentary.
Maybe we need to go extreme ways because we can't wait for the crisis to actually happen.
No, I agree. Like communication is a very thing to it, and this is why we're doing a documentary. This is why it's also interesting to work with. Like you could do a similar project without graphical support or urbanism or communication. But for us, it's a very, very central element to it because you need to convey a clearer message, and the wrapping and the form of that message is key. And I don't know if we are looking into we're going to produce a kind of newspaper that is going to be widely distributed in Brussels with kind of this kind of information, short films, events, that kind of thing. But I don't know if you have the money to do commercials, but I think you should fire with everything that you have.
Well, partly answering the question there. but how do you plan to engage the social part of society that does not want to engage there? I mean, for example, we got these glasses, these cups, that they're not recyclable at all, and they end up being killed or incineration plant, which in this case is an area. How do you plan to target the part of society who deliberately doesn't want to engage in these issues?
I think that's why, like, for example, this is an example of how these three things could go together. So let's say you are able to target a certain kind of population that says, like, okay, I understood what you're doing. I'm trying to sort better. I'm not putting organic waste in the rest bin, and I'm not putting the rest in the organic waste bin. Like, I understood. And you go forward with social initiatives that amplify this these group of people. But then, obviously, some people won't get it. You try to communicate with all means that you have, but some people won't get it. So you need some kind of mechanical and chemical treatment to sort these errors out. So you need to improve the technology that we have to reduce the errors technically somehow. You try to decrease them socially, but still you will have them. So the technology has to still be improved, But then you should have a third, like kind of biological approach to it, of saying whatever cup you have, it should be biodegradable. So if you don't care and if you don't understand it, you can't make a mistake, because we also have a biological backup of saying if you put something else, it's a kind of plastic that is biodegradable. And this is why we need like biochemical research as well, and like, for example, political will to completely prohibit plastic that is not biodegradable, like plastic bags and these cups. So if all three strategies go together, like you have a good social strategy of education, amplification, activation of people who get it, and they're gonna grow because you're gonna support them, you give them money, you give them information leaflets, you give them space, and all that. You have very high performing technology that is coherent with what you're doing on a social level to sort if you put really the wrong stuff in the wrong place. But then you also have kind of a biochemical solution of saying, okay, the cup in any case, even if he puts it in the wrong space, it's not going to cause cancer, like in 50, 20 years if it gets the countryside. So this is an example of how these three could go together for the specific case of your cup that you mentioned.
Maybe we already have kind of things that we can do to save those people that are actually doing, like, for example, in Italy where I live, we have really strict rules about recycling, and individually we have our things to put, like every day you have something and they come home by home, and if you don't put the right thing in it, then they're gonna give you like a bill to pay and stuff. So yeah, we are already the people that are doing it, we are saving those kind of things, using it in the right way. Of course there are some people who are not doing it, but at least we are already like saving what is possible to save.
So what's your question? Whether
I was just like asking, because it looks like that, for example, if in Barcelona they would use the...
we are not fine. No, that's like it's a very interesting thing, like in Barcelona, like in Catalonia. The obligation and the fines and the incentives are not at the level of the individual that puts stuff in the wrong bag. They're at the level of the municipalities. So the municipalities are fined. And some municipalities say, wow, like, really have to do something very, very good. And you have 600 municipalities in Barcelona and Catalonia, and some do a very, very good job. But some, like the Ayuntamiento de Barcelona, like the city of Barcelona, they're doing a less good job, and then they're just accepted I don't know if they just accept, but then they have higher rates of impurity. They don't have any fines at the citizen level. So obviously you have to find something like the right incentive scheme at the local level. But something like, for the amplification of people who do the right thing, and especially like this compost guy, like, one of the things that we're trying... Stefan needs a last call for Ryanair to Brussels, huh? Because you have to. But really just. So just like last thing, and I really have to go. Yeah, like one thing that we are trying to establish is, like, me as an economist, I'm very interested in that. Like the actual cost of all this, like, you know, the cost of the pre-treatment phase in a digester, because people don't do the right thing, is absolutely enormous. Like, you know, we're really talking not about the millions and millions of euros that you need to put this system in place, but also the maintenance and the running of that system is really, really expensive, you know. So if somebody is doing the correct thing, like let's say the guy with his community compost, even if the volumes that he's treating in the right way are not very, very high, he's actually saving a lot of money to the ayuntamiento by doing the right thing, you know. And this money, that, like, if you calculate how much it is.
My question is that I'm like worried about all these things because I don't.
I'm also worried. That's good. We should all be worried about it. That's already.
I see that the topic that we were talking about, the question that I did before, is like, okay, we have to not grow and not grow economically, and then how can these three topics that I found them very expensive, the three of them, social activity, mechanical, chemical, and biological investigation, the three of them are very expensive. So how can we, like, balance the not economical growth and all this money that
is needed? Yeah, that is needed. Yeah. I mean, you're asking the right questions. Of course, it's like these are the kind of things that you have to answer. But like, to begin with, the current situation in the 80s and 90s is much more expensive, I think, if you get a coherence between your three things. Because the standard technocratic solution is absolutely enormous in terms of the money that it costs. Like, you know, to give it, like, you know, the treatment plant that I showed, like the digester, the last digester that they built here is 32 million euros in building, and it costs more than 100 euros to get the stuff there, like 100 euros per ton of organic waste, of the stuff that they have in the organic bins, to 100 euros to get it to the plant, because the plant is far away, in contrast to the compost station of the neighbor that is just downstairs. So you have to, and it's 80% water, so you're carrying 80% water to a treatment plant somewhere, you know, so it's expensive. And it costs around 120 euros for the treatment of each ton. So you have like 240 euros for each ton of treatment, plus the 32 million euros that it costs to build the plant. You know? So the current model, if you really look at the numbers, is something that needs economic growth, because you have to pay back the debt that you incurred to make the initial investment. You know, and this is, I think, the spiral that we have to get out of. Like, you know, it's not like the current situations. Like, you know, you make a lot of, you know, public debt to buy big installations, and in order to repay them, we need economic growth. You know, so you have to find a situation in which the investments that you're doing are lower. The maintenance costs are maybe the same, but they shouldn't be maintenance costs of machinery, but people that work. You know, so the 220 euros that are paid each ton to treat them, the 220 euros should be paid for somebody's salary and not for the machinery